everyone, and welcome to the introduction to Masechet Avodah Zarah. For those of you who are in Israel, I hope that this introduction is finding you safe and sound wherever you may be. Perhaps there's no more of an apt setting than war to discuss Masechet Avodah Zarah. Masechet Avodah Zarah deals with the relationships between Jews and non-Jews. And the Masechet begins from a point in the Torah which talks about battling and fighting against non-Jews. Let me open up some sources here. Already in the Ten Commandments, the very second commandment in the Ten Commandments is, you shall have no other gods beside me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in heavens above or the earth below or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I am your God Hashem. I'm an impassioned God. So the idea that there's other gods, other people believe in other gods, but the Jewish people should only have one God is a very central idea that needs to be mentioned right away at the very beginning of the Ten Commandments. And here it's presented in a theological context, right? You must believe that there is only one God. I am the God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and you shall have no other gods besides me. And obviously, that is a message and a context which repeats itself many times throughout the Torah. But we also find the objection to Avodah Zarah in a different context, which is built upon the first context. And this is a more social claim that the Torah is making. So a few chapters later, in Exodus 34, the Torah says, beware of making a covenant with the inhabitants of the land against which you are advancing, lest they be a snare in your midst. No, you must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, and cut down their sacred posts, for you must not worship any other God besides Hashem, whose name is impassioned, Kana, an impassioned God. You must not make a covenant with the inhabitants of the land, for they will lust after their gods and sacrifice to their gods and invite you, and you will eat of their sacrifices. And when you take wives into your households from among their daughters for your sons, their daughters will lust after their gods and will cause your sons to lust after their gods. You shall not make molten gods for yourselves. So here, the argument is not only a theological argument that you should not believe in other gods and you should not worship other gods, but also that you should not become embroiled, or you should not become integrated into the people who believe in other gods, because they will cause you to eventually, they'll cause you or they'll cause the next generation, your daughters and your sons, to lust after their gods. So the objection to Avodah Zarah is both a theological objection, but it also has an important social implication, which is that this distinction between you, the people of Israel who believe in only one God, and the non-Jews who believe in other foreign gods, Avodah Zarah, this distinction actually creates a very important social distinction, which means that you have to stay far away from them. And you have to actually act in a very violent way, right? You must tear down their altars, smash their pillars, and cut down their sacred posts in order to make it very, very, very clear that you're not only keeping your distance from people who worship these foreign gods, but you're fighting against them very, very violently. Now, the problem is that for the rabbis of the Mishnah, this wasn't really a realistic proposition. We know from archaeological evidence to what extent Jews in the period of the Mishnah in the Galil and in Yehuda were integrated with non-Jews. In some archaeological sites, we can even find on the same street, we'll find a synagogue and a pagan altar and a Christian house of worship. So we know that there were many different groups and they were all living next to each other on the very same streets. Not only that, but Jews from the period of the Mishnah were the minority. They were living under Roman rule. So they couldn't really go around smashing and tearing down Roman pagan altars and cutting down their sacred posts. That wasn't realistic. And so what we find in the Mishnah is an attempt to adhere to the commandments of the Torah regarding Avodah Zarah, but also to figure out a way to live with pagans and to be able to communicate with them and come into contact with them on a daily basis without being violent towards them in a way that a minority group just cannot do. So the three main areas that the Masechet deals with are derived from this principle. The first part of the Masechet deals with financial negotiations with Ovdei Avodah Zarah. What can you buy from them? What can't you buy from them? When can you buy from them and when can't you buy with them? So the very first Mishnah of the Masechet discusses the days on which you can engage in business with idol worshippers, not to do so 3 days before their festivals, because when you do so, then you're making them happy. They got a good deal. Then they'll go bring a sacrifice to their idols, and thereby the Jew is contributing to idol worship, and therefore such an action is prohibited. So the first part of the Masechet deals with various questions that have to do with negotiations and business together with idol worshippers. The second part of the Masechet deals with Isurei Hana'ah. So what are the objects and foodstuffs and other items that belong to idol worshippers that Jews can use and which can they not use? And as a part of this discussion, the third part of the Masechet will really develop one specific kind of Isur Hana'ah, which is the Isur of Yein Nesech, of drinking wine that was touched by an idol worshiper, because of the idea that any wine that comes into contact with an idol worshiper, they take a little bit of wine and they bring it as a sacrifice. They say some kind of some words that designate the wine as a sacrifice to their gods, and therefore any wine that a non-Jew was in contact with is problematic for Jews. Now, so we can see that, in general, the idea is that any business or anything that belongs to a non-Jew is going to create problems for a Jew. However, we can also see throughout the Masechet how much Jews are actually engaging in contact with non-Jews. So if we look, for instance, at chapter 3, Mishnah 6, the Mishnah discusses a person whose house is adjacent to a house of idol worship, and there's actually just one wall that's separating a Jew's house and a place of idol worship. And the Mishnah says, if this house fell down, it's prohibited to rebuild it. So what should the Jew do? He should withdraw into his own property 4 cubits and build the wall there. However, if the space between the two parts of the wall belonged both to the Jew and to the house of idol worship, then this area is treated as half and half, and a person can withdraw from that joint area. So we can see here how the Mishnah is really describing this integration of Jews and non-Jews in one space. And the problem is that if the house falls down and the Jew is now rebuilding his wall, then he's also rebuilding a pagan temple. So the Jew has to withdraw into his own area. So the Mishnah is offering the Jew a solution here, right? Yes, you can continue living next to a non-Jew, but here's a solution how you can rebuild your house without contributing to the building of a pagan temple. So the Mishnah is trying to create here some kind of neutral ground that's going to allow for the interaction between a Jew and non-Jew in a space that's it's not pure, it's not just Jewish, it's not just a space where people worship Hashem. It's a space where there are people who are worshiping to idols, and therefore it's defiled. So the Mishnah is trying to create a space here for Jews to coexist with what the Torah has designated as their enemies, their religious enemies. And now they're going to be able to, the Mishnah is trying to create a kind of space where Jews can interact with pagans, but they're not pagans. They're just people who are living in this space. I'll give another example. The Mishnah at the beginning of chapter 2 says that it distinguishes between a Jewish woman who shouldn't deliver the child of a gentlewoman, because by doing so she's being a midwife to a child who we know is going to engage in idol worship. But on the other hand, it is permitted for a Gentile woman to deliver the child of a Jewish woman. Okay, so Jews are going to need midwives. And so we're not going to say, no contact is permitted between Jews and non-Jews, but a Jewish woman can avail herself of the services of a non-Jewish midwife. So the issue here is how to create some kind of boundary and some kind of passive resistance to idol worship, but not to create a complete war in the way that the Torah describes, because that's just not realistic for the Mishnah. While the Torah can say, kill every pagan who you see who is engaged in idol worship, that's not something that's realistic for the period of the Mishnah and later of the Talmuds. I want to give another example from a story that's brought in the Mishnah, which is kind of the epitome of this idea of creating neutral ground. The story tells of, oh, wait 1 second. The story describes Proclus ben Philosophus, who asked a question of Rabban Gamliel in the city of Akko in the bathhouse of Aphrodite. So we hear here that Rabban Gamliel is bathing in the bathhouse. This bathhouse is called the bathhouse of Aphrodite. So it's a bathhouse that could be understood to be a bathhouse of idol worship. But these are public institutions where Jews meet pagans and everyone bathes together because that's where you go to bathe. There aren't bathhouses that are just for Jews. So Proclus ben Philosophus asks Rabban Gamliel, it's written in your Torah, nothing of the prescribed items shall cleave to your hand. For what reason do you bathe in the bathhouse of Aphrodite? How can it be that you're going to a house of Avodah Zarah and bathing there? Rabban Gamliel answers him and says, one can't answer questions related to Torah in the bathhouse. Let's go out. When they leave, Rabban Gamliel said to him two answers. He said to him, first of all, Ani lo bati legvula, hi bata legvuli. I did not come into its domain, into the domain of the Avodah Zarah. The Avodah Zarah came into my domain. What does he mean to say by that? He means that I came for the bathhouse. I didn't come for the Avodah Zarah. I just came to bathe, and it just happens to be it's a kind of non-essential feature of this bathhouse that it also has a statue of Aphrodite erected there. And he says, he supports this claim by saying, people don't say, let us make the bathhouse as an adornment for Aphrodite. Rather, they say, let us make a statue of Aphrodite as an adornment for the bathhouse. And further, he says, alternatively, there's another answer. Even if people would give you a lot of money, you would not enter before your object of idol worship naked, or as one who experienced a seminal emission, nor would you urinate before it. This statue stands upon the sewage pipe, and all the people urinate before it. So the second argument is, well, it can't be that even you're taking this idol worship seriously, because you're coming to the bathhouse naked and behaving in a way that you wouldn't behave in a house of worship. And therefore, we don't need to take this so seriously either. Okay, so we can see here in this story two things. The first is that where the rabbis find a way to look at the reality that is before them that could perhaps by more fundamentalist views say, okay, once there's a statue of Aphrodite on the bathhouse, then it's completely defiled and we can't use it. But that would just leave them with no bathhouse. Okay, they would go to the marketplace and there's statues in the marketplace. Oh, well, then we can't go to the marketplace and we can't engage in business with non-Jews. That would eventually result in a kind of fundamentalist perspective of withdrawing, right? Of just saying, okay, Jews cannot exist in the Roman world because it's a pagan world, therefore we have to leave. And that is actually what certain Jewish groups did, right? For instance, the groups, the Qumran sect, who distanced itself from the Roman world, went to live in a kind of ideal world for them in the caves in the Dead Sea and completely withdrew from the non-Jewish world. So that's one strategy. Another strategy is a strategy that the Torah describes of, complete annihilation and fighting and destruction of the pagan world. And that's also not a strategy that the Mishnah sees as realistic. So the Mishnah is choosing here a kind of path between these two extremes of complete violence towards the pagan world or complete withdrawal from the pagan world. And it's trying to create a way of looking at the pagan world and making this constant distinctions. What is considered pagan worship and what isn't considered pagan worship? And that's really the main central question that accompanies the whole Masechet. And the second thing that we see here in this story is the idea of annulling Avodah Zarah bitul avodah zarah, which becomes a very important focus of the Masechet, especially towards the end of chapter 3 and in chapter 4, right? What does Rabban Gamliel say here in the story? He says, well, we see that you, the non-Jews, are not treating this statue seriously because you're standing before it naked and you're urinating before it. Therefore, we don't have to treat it as idol worship either. And that's an idea that's very much developed in chapter 4. And the Mishnah actually says explicitly, it talks about bitul, nullification of avodah zarah, and it says, what is the nullification? What's the description of the nullification of avodah zarah? Ketzad mevatla? How does a Gentile revoke the status of an object of idol worship? If he cuts off the tip of its ear, or the tip of its nose, or its fingertip, or he crushes it, even though he did not remove any part of it. Through all of this, he has revoked the status of a object of idol worship. So the idea of bitul avodah zarah, the nullification of avodah zarah, is innovative in two senses. First of all, in contrast to the biblical worldview, which is that you have to completely destroy avodah zarah, here the Mishnah is saying, no, you don't have to completely destroy avodah zarah. You just have to show that this avodah zarah isn't serious in some way that shows a kind of derogatory manner towards the avodah zarah. And secondly, in contrast to the biblical worldview, which says the Jew has to go out and destroy the avodah zarah, here the Mishnah is saying the nullification of avodah zarah, the revoking the status of avodah zarah, is actually done by the goy, by the non-Jew. If he shows that he doesn't take the avodah zarah seriously, then the Jew can now treat this avodah zarah as something that is not really avodah zarah, and therefore you can engage in commerce, or you can buy this object, or you can use this object for various uses. So this is a very central idea throughout the Masechet, which is a kind of mechanism that the rabbis develop in order to be able to function within the non-Jewish society that they're living within. I want to say another general statement about the Masechet, and with this to conclude. Although we find interactions with non-Jews throughout the Shas in various different contexts, in context of damages, in context of marital questions, Masechet Avodah Zarah is really the most focused place where interactions with non-Jews are discussed. And for that reason, it's also one of the central places that we can see attitudes towards non-Jews. How do Chazal think about non-Jews as a category? And something that's very interesting that I want to point out, and that you'll see as we go along through the Masechet, is that there's a very big difference between the way that Chazal discuss non-Jews as a category. For instance, in the opening sugya of the Masechet, there's a sugya that deals with non-Jews in general, non-Jews acceptance or lack of acceptance of the Torah. And in general, when Chazal are just thinking about umot ha'olam, or all of the non-Jews, then often the approach will be very negative and very derogatory. But by contrast, throughout the Masechet, and especially in the Bavli, I think this is even more true, Chazal often invoke stories about individual non-Jews. And then often their approach will be very positive towards these non-Jews. For instance, we'll see a whole sequence of stories about Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi and Antoninus. And there, it seems like there's a very warm relationship, and there's much to be learned from each other. And it's not just, the Jew comes out with the upper hand and the non-Jew is humiliated. Not at all. That doesn't seem to be what's going on there. Um, um, and there seems to be a more positive approach towards a specific non-Jew. Another example is the famous story of Dama ben Netina, which is brought in Masechet Kiddushin in the context of a non-Jew who is so respectful towards his father that he doesn't wake him, even though he can make a huge profit. And Chazal raise up the example of Dama ben Netina as someone who engaged in respect for parents in a way that should be emulated. And this story is repeated also within Masechet Avodah Zarah. So when the focus is on individual non-Jews, it turns out that the approach can be a lot more positive than when we're talking about non-Jews as a category. This is true also for certain halachic sugiyot that will appear throughout the Masechet. For instance, on Daf Yud Aleph, the Masechet talks about the prohibition of bichukotehem lo telechu, that you should not go in the paths of non-Jews. And there's a discussion there about is the problem just in general, as a category, anything that non-Jews do, we should immediately dismiss and see it as negative? Or the other approach in the sugya is, wait, shouldn't we think legufo shel inyan? Shouldn't we think, more to the point of the practice that we're discussing, and distinguish between practices that may have a good reason and should be adopted, and other practices that should be dismissed, but not in general, anything that non-Jews do should be dismissed. The same is true also for a discussion on Daf Yud Chet about Moshav Leitzim. How do we treat the stadiums and the theaters of non-Jews, and in general, culture, non-Jewish culture? How should non-Jewish culture be treated? Is anything that non-Jews engage in, theater, music, categorically wrong, and we should distance ourselves from anything like that has to do with culture that is not Jewish? Or should we look at, again, should we think about what's the content? What kind of plays, what kind of music is being played? And maybe in certain instances, it is justified to be part of the non-Jewish culture. So again, we can see how, as Chazal take these ideas seriously and try to implement them in their lives, they have to do a lot of negotiation and a lot of distinctions in order to create categories that will allow them to coexist with non-Jews in non-Jewish society, while still preserving their own distinctive beliefs and practices. And so this whole Masechet is a negotiation of various practices. And through this negotiation, it's also a way of negotiating identity, of trying to define what is unique about the Jewish people and about Jewish practice, and in what ways can Jews become part of the broader world. Besorot tovot to everyone, and enjoy learning this fascinating Masechet.